Chapter 17 of Pawns in the Game by William Guy Carr. World War II breaks out. After King Edward VIII abdicated, many well-educated Britishers, including members of Parliament and retired naval and military officers of high rank, carried out a strenuous campaign to try to convince the leaders of the British government of the truth regarding the international bankers' conspiracy. Amongst these were Capt. A.H.M. Ramsay and Admiral Sir Barry Domville, KBE, CB, CMG. Captain Ramsay was educated at Eton College and Sandhurst Military College. He served with His Majesty's Guard in France from 1914 to 1916, when he was seriously wounded. He was appointed to Regimental HQ after recovering from his wounds. Later, he was transferred to the British War Office. He served with the British War Mission in Paris until the war ended. He was elected to Parliament in 1931 as member of the Midlothian Peeblesshire and served in that capacity until 1945. Admiral Sir Barry Domville had a brilliant naval career. He earned the reputation of being one of Britain's better gunnery officers. He started his naval service in 1894 as a midshipman in sail and steam-driven warships. Because of ability, he received accelerated promotion and was made lieutenant in 1898. In 1906, he was awarded the Gold Medal of the Royal United Services Institution. He was placed in command of destroyers in 1910. When World War I appeared unavoidable, he was appointed Assistant Secretary to the Committee of Imperial Defense. After hostilities started, he was appointed to the Harwich striking force, consisting of light cruisers and destroyers under Admiral Sir Reginald Tyrwhitt. He commanded 7 destroyers and lit cruisers, all of which earned an unviable reputation as fighting ships. He was made flag captain to Admiral Tyrwhitt in 1917 and served in that capacity until the end of the war. His post-war service included Director of Naval Intelligence, President of the Royal Naval College, Greenwich, and Vice Admiral commanding the War College. He retired in 1936 with the rank of full admiral. During the years 1920-1923, because of his special ability and varied experience, he was first Assistant Director and subsequently Director of the Plan Policy Division of the Admiralty Naval Staff. In this capacity, he entered a number of conferences at Paris, Brussels, Spa, San Remo, and the Washington Naval Conference. Both these ex-officers, one Army, the other Navy, suspected the Bolshevik Revolution in Russia had been plotted and planned, financed, and directed by men who considered the liquidation of the British Empire was essential before they could achieve undisputed control of the wealth, natural resources, and manpower of the entire world. Both these gentlemen have been frank to admit that until 1935 they had failed to identify those who constituted the secret power behind the world revolutionary movement and international affairs. In 1933, by reason of their studies and research, they reached the decision that the leaders of the world Jewry, headed by the international Jewish bankers, were the secret power behind the world revolutionary movement. They became convinced that these men used the wealth they possessed to purchase sufficient power to influence international affairs in such a manner as to bring nations into conflict with each other. They also reached the conclusion that the motive behind the long-range plan was to establish the Messianic Age, so that international Jewry with a central government in Palestine could enforce their totalitarian ideology upon the peoples of the entire world. With this latter conclusion, I agree. As the reader knows, I admit going through the same period, i.e., 1907 to 1933. In no doubt and uncertainty, but in 1939 I became convinced, after the way the Jews had been purged by Stalin in Russia and used to start abortive revolutions in other countries, and then abandoned to their fates, that the men who constituted the secret power behind national and international affairs were the Illuminati, who used Zionism and anti-Semitism, communism and fascism, socialism and selfish capitalism to further their secret plans to bring about a one-world government, which they intended to control in exactly the same way as they had controlled Russia, in the person of Lenin after October 1917. A worldwide dictatorship is the only type of government which could, by policy rule, enforce their edicts upon the people, and thus assure peace. If there is only one state governed by one dictator, there can't be any wars. This is pure logic, because to have a dispute, a quarrel, a fight, a revolution, or a war, there must of necessity be two individuals holding opposing ideas and opinions which they intend to make the other party accept by force of arms if argument and negotiation fail. Furthermore, my studies and research convinced me that from the time of Christ right down to the present day, the men who have been the secret power behind national and international intrigue have always used their wealth illegally to obtain the power and influence to put their secret plots and plans into effect. They have used usury, bribery, corruption, graft, illegal methods of traffic and trade, slavery, assassinations, wars, revolutions, prostitution, drugs, liquor, and every other form of licentious and vice to bribe, blackmail, or in other ways force unwilling humans to do their bidding. These tools, be they Jew or Gentile, Freemason, or otherwise, have been, without exception, liquidated by one method or another, if, after serving their purpose, they were considered to know too much. Considering these facts, I became convinced that the top conspirators did not belong to any one race or nation. They were agents of Satan, doing his will and serving his purpose here on earth. The one and only purpose of the devil is to win the souls of men away from Almighty God. The men who plot and planned wars and revolutions have done a great deal to bring about a godless world. This reasoning enabled me to understand the evil genius of these men. They could not move nearer to their totalitarian materialistic goal without fomenting wars and revolutions. They must of necessity destroy the civilization founded in accordance with the divine plan of creation before they could impose their evil totalitarian ideology upon the peoples of the world. Both Captain Ramsay and Admiral Danville tried from 1936 to 1939 to prevent Britain becoming engaged in war with Germany, because they considered international Jewry intended to arrange a war in which the German and British empires would destroy each other. The people who survived could be easily subjugated by communism afterward, in exactly the same way had been communized. I agree that World War II was engineered by the Illuminati, who used anti-communism, anti-fascism, anti-Semitism, and anti-everything else to further their evil long-range plans and secret totalitarian ambitions. I arrived at the conclusion that it was a fatal mistake to be anti-anything but anti-evil. I believe the only way to defeat the diabolical international conspiracy is to educate as many people as possible in regard to the truth and convince them that they have been used as pawns in the game by these evil men. Captain Ramsay tried hard to convince Mr. Neville Chamberlain that it was against the best interest of the British Empire to allow the international conspirators to involve Britain in war with Germany. He was right. He did not convince the British Prime Minister, but he at least impressed him sufficiently so that he went to Munich, he comprised with Hitler, and returned to England waving exuberantly his famous umbrella, and a paper which he said was an agreement guaranteeing peace in our time. Immediately, this announcement was made. The press, controlled by the international bankers, stated an anti-fascist campaign of hate. The controlled press damned Chamberlain as an old woman willing to buy peace at any price. They lampooned him with his umbrella. They accused him of being pro-fascist. Their agents in Moscow burned Chamberlain in effigy in the public squares. The British people was never allowed to know the difference between pagan Aryan Nazism and Christian anti-communistic fascism. According to the press, German and Italian fascism are both black pagan atheistic ideologies and totalitarian in purpose. Few people understand the difference between Nazism and fascism, and communism and socialism. Space does not permit recording all the details of the intrigue put into effect by the evil group who were determined to bring about the way between Britain and Germany. In my opinion, Hitler's anti-Semitic policy was wrong, but throwing Britain and Germany at each other's throat wasn't going to save the Jews residing in Germany, Poland, and other countries from persecution and death. Forcing the countries into a war enabled the anti-Semitic hatreds of the Nazis to be vented on the Jews by direct action of a tremendous scale, with a hideous ferocity only witnessed previously during a revolutionary reign of terror. If those who claim the way was brought about by the international Jews and not the Illuminati, who don't give a damn for the Jews or anybody else for that matter, would stop and think, they will realize that by fomenting World War II, those responsible condemned a great many innocent Jewish people to death, while most of the Jewish revolutionary communists escaped death by going underground, and later obtained illegal entrance into Palestine, the United States of America, Canada, and other countries. If peace had continued, the German anti-Semitic feelings could never have reached the extremes they reached during the war. A peaceful solution could have been found for the problem, but no, the long-range plan of the international Illuminati called for the destruction of the British, the German empires, and the Jews, who were not actively communists and therefore not their tools. Captain Ramsay had promised Mr. Neville Chamberlain that he would produce documentary evidence to prove a conspiracy existed to force Britain into declaring war on Germany. This evidence consisted of a secret coded cables which had passed between Mr. Winston Churchill and President Roosevelt. Unknown to Mr. Chamberlain, the then Prime Minister, Captain Ramsay offered to obtain copies of the documents to prove that the international bankers were determined to bring about World War II for the purpose of bringing the rest of the European nations under communist control. The Illuminati control both. Tyler Kent was the coding officer who had coded and uncoded these secret documents in the American Embassy in London. Anna Wolkoff was his assistant. Like Guzenko, they felt sick at the thoughts of the world being plunged into another global war to further the ambitions of a few totalitarian-minded men whose wealth compelled even presidents and top-level statesmen to do their will. The same conditions existed in 1938 as existed in Paris in 1919 prior to the signing of the Treaty of Versailles. Tyler Kent, like many other people, knew Captain Ramsay was suspicious of an international Jewish conspiracy. He knew Captain Ramsay was trying to prevent the war. When Captain Ramsay told him Mr. Chamberlain would prevent such a conspiracy from being put into effect if he was given authentic documentary evidence to prove such a international conspiracy did actually exist, Tyler Kent offered to show Captain Ramsay the damning documents in his flat at 47 Gloucester Palace, London. The international conspirators had, however, been busy. In March 1939, they had tricked Mr. Chamberlain into signing a guarantee to protect Poland from German aggression by preventing him with a false report to the effect that a 48-hour ultimatum had been delivered by Germany to the Poles. The facts are that the German government did not issue a 48-hour ultimatum. The German notes set forth reasonable suggestions for a peaceful solution of the problems created by the Treaty of Versailles in regard to the Polish corridor and Danzig. History will prove that the only reason the Polish government ignored the German notes was because of the agents of the international conspirator advised it, leading statesmen that the British guarantee assured them against German aggression. Month after month went by and still Poland ignored the German note completely. Meanwhile, the anti-German press speeded up its torrents of abuse against Hitler because he had dared to defy the power of the international money barons. Hitler had earned their hatred by his independent financial policy and monetary reforms. The public was made to believe, and at that time, what I also made to believe, that Hitler's word couldn't be trusted. The public was told after his putsch in Sudetenland that Hitler had said he intended to make no further demands. It was made to appear by the press that the German notes to Poland suggested a peaceful solution to the problems created by the Treaty of Versailles was another demand and therefore a broken promise. History proves it was no such thing. What Hitler had said after that he would make no further demands after he had rectified the injustices inflicted upon the German people because of those who had dictated the terms and conditions incorporated into the Treaty of Versailles. That is a horse of a very different color. It is a typical example of how a half-truth is far more dangerous than a direct lie. Hitler's promise was qualified. He promised he would make no further demands after the problems involved in Sudetenland, part of Czechoslovakia, the Polish corridor, and Danzig had been solved. The German grievances were real and justified. By the Treaty of Versailles, the Polish corridor had separated East Prussia from the rest of Germany. Danzig, a purely German city, had been isolated. The Germans who had remained in the territory, which became known as Czechoslovakia, had been persecuted. The expressed wish of the Austrian people to unite with Germany for their own protection against communist aggression had been denied. Generally speaking, public opinion in the Western world had been molded to blame France for the nations which formed the Little Entente for insisting on this policy towards Germany. It cannot be denied that the post-war policy of the Allied powers toward Germany was in direct contradiction to the principles of self-determination, which had been accepted by the governments involved on behalf of the people who had elected them to manage their affairs. Each succeeding German democratic chancellor had tried by diplomatic negotiation to obtain redress and had failed. It was their failure to obtain justice by peaceful means that influenced the German people when they swept Hitler to power. Winston Churchill labeled Hitler that monstrous abortion of lies and deceits. But it cannot truthfully be denied that in 1939, Hitler was trying once again to rearrange a peaceful solution of the problems created by the Polish corridor and Danzig. When the agents of the international conspirator deceived the Prime Minister Chamberlain into believing that Hitler had issued an ultimatum to the Polish government and had moved in his armies to back up his demands, it was this act of deception that caused Mr. Chamberlain to reluctantly advise His Majesty's government to declare war on Germany. This is a grave accusation to make, but its truth and justification is proved by the fact that exactly the same thing happens all over again towards the end of and immediately after the end of World War II. It would be ridiculous to suppose that sincere Christian statesmen could repeat and compound such injustices as those perpetrated by the Treaty of Versailles. But these injustices were repeated by the Allied powers by the adoption of the policy of unconditional surrender, by the adoption of the Stalin-White's Morgenthau economic plan, by the partitioning of Germany, by the evil motives behind the German rearmament plan, by the post-war crisis with France, and, as it will be explained in another chapter, by the dangerous game that has been played between the international finance interests and the Soviet and Chinese dictators since the war with Japan ended. Any unbiased person must admit that it is not the common people of the democracies who demand that their governments carry out such a policy of hatred and injustice against the German people. It is not the elected representatives of the people who conceive these diabolical programs of persecution and irritation. It is the evil powers behind the scenes of government who are responsible. Their evil policy is based on devilish cunning. They know that a house divided against itself must surely fall, that nations divided against each other must surely be subjugated also. The more human beings are forced to fight each other, the stronger grow those who sit back and push them into the wars. By allowing this secret scheming, plotting, and planning to continue, we are allowing the forces of evil to make us commit national and racial suicide. When Hitler tried waiting for Poland's reply and of being insulted by the Allied press, he moved his armies into Poland. Britain then declared war in accordance with her agreement. The criminal nature of the advice given Poland can be realized by the fact that although Britain declared war on Germany, she was powerless to give Poland any direct aid, either naval, military, or with air power. No lesser an authority than Lord Lothian, who was in recent years the British ambassador to the United States, stated in his last speech he made at the Chatham House, "If the principles of self-determination had been applied in Germany's favor as it was applied against her, it would have meant the return of Sudetenland, Czechoslovakia, parts of Poland, the Polish corridor, the Danzig, to the Reich." It is safe to assume that had the British people been permitted to be correctly informed regarding these matters, they would have never permitted war to have been declared. But it was war, not truth or justice, upon which the international conspirators were determined. Even though Britain had declared war, Hitler refused to depart from the policy he had set forth in Mein Kampf regarding Britain and her empire. He ordered the generals to commands of the famous Panzer Corps to halt on May 22nd, 1940, when they could easily have driven the British armies into the sea or made them surrender. Captain Lidlhart, in his book The Other Side of the Hill, quotes Hitler's telegram to General von Kleist: "The Armored divisions are to remain at the medium artillery range from Dunkirk. Permission is only granted for reconnaissance and protective movements." General von Kleist was one of the Germans who didn't agree with Hitler's policy towards Britain. He decided to ignore the order. Captain Hart quotes von Kleist as telling him after the events, "They came a more empathetic order. I was ordered to withdraw behind the canal. My tanks were kept halted there for 3 days." Captain Hart next quotes a conversation which took place between Hitler, Marshal von Rundstedt, and 2 members of his staff. According to Marshal von Rundstedt, Hitler then astonished us by speaking with admiration of the British Empire, of the necessity of its existence, and of the civilization that Britain had brought into the world. He compared the British people with the Catholic Church, saying they were both essential elements of sustainability in the world. He said all he wanted from Britain was that she should acknowledge Germany's position on the continent. The return of Germany's lost colonies would be desirable but not essential, and he would even support Britain with the troops if she should be involved in difficulties anywhere. He concluded by saying that his aim was to make peace with Britain on a basis that she would regard compatible with her honor. Thus it was that Britain was given time to organize her evacuation forces and get her soldiers back from Dunkirk. It will be recalled that for the first few months of the Second World War, Hitler did not bomb Britain. While Neville Chamberlain remained Prime Minister, Britain did not bomb Germany. The controlled press called it a phony war. It is quite obvious that 2 great empires cannot destroy each other if they not fight. Chamberlain would not initiate the offensive because he was most convinced that he had been the victim of international intrigue. Mr. Winston Churchill had been given full powers and responsibilities regarding all naval, military, and air operations. He decided he would take the initiative. Churchill conceived the idea of the Norway Gamble. This poorly planned and executed combined operations involved Britain's army, navy, and air force. It was doomed to failure because those involved ever got into action. Even a person with only an elementary knowledge of the military strategy would have realized that such an operation could not possibly succeed unless the invading forces had control of the Kattegat and Skagerrak. Churchill had this fact pointed out to him by competent naval authorities. Churchill was not a fool, but he went ahead with the project in opposition to his naval and military advisors, exactly as he had done when he sent the naval division to save Antwerp in 1914, and when he insisted upon the invasion of Gallipoli in 1915. The results in all 3 of Churchill's gambles were the same: no gains, severe reverses, exceptionally heavy casualties, and loss of valuable equipment and materials. The fiasco of the Norway Gamble was not blamed on Churchill, however. His friends, the international money barons, used their control of the press to release their full powers of hatred, criticism, invective, censure, sarcasm, and satire against the Prime Minister, Mr. Chamberlain. They wanted Chamberlain out of the way so they could put Winston Churchill in his place to turn the phony war into a shooting war. This propaganda campaign forced Chamberlain to resign, exactly as Mr. Asquith had been forced to resign in 1915. Thus, once again, history repeats itself. In May 1940, Churchill again joins hands with the Socialists to form a new government. Mr. J.M. Spite, CBE, was the principal assistant secretary to the British Air Ministry during World War II. In his book Bombing Vindicated, published in 1944, he reveals that the ruthless bombing of German cities started on May 11, 1940, the evening of the day Winston Churchill became Prime Minister. Britain started the bombing, and, as was to be expected, Germany retaliated. Thus, the war was placed on a destructive basis. Mr. Speight also reveals that on September 2nd, 1939, when Mr. Chamberlain was still in office, a declaration had been made by the British and French governments that only strictly military objectives, in the narrow sense of the word, would be bombarded. Churchill's policy to bomb open towns and cities has been defended, but it never can be justified. There is another point, not generally known, that needs to be mentioned. It has been recorded that many German generals did not agree with Hitler's policy. The Nazi warlords knew they had to get Hitler out of the way and subjugate the communist dictatorships controlled by Stalin before they could carry out their long-range plans for world domination. The all-out war against Britain was not in keeping with their program. Russian communism and the Jews had to be subjugated and destroyed before they could launch their attack westward and subjugate Britain and the United States. This was the Nazi plan, not the fascist policy. The Nazi plan was international in scope. The fascist cause was national. A secret meeting of Nazi warlords was held in May 1941. They decided they would use Hitler's friendly policy towards Britain to try to get Britain to call off the war against Germany. Rudolf Hess was instructed to fly to Scotland and contact Lord Hamilton and Churchill so he could try to influence the British government to sign a peace treaty. Hess was instructed to tell the British government that if they would sign a peace treaty, the German generals would get rid of Hitler and then concentrate all their military power on the destruction of communism in Russia and other European countries. Hitler knew nothing of this plan. Hess flew to Scotland, but Churchill refused to agree to the offer made by Hess. The German generals then persuaded Hitler to undertake an all-out offensive against Russia, pointing out that until Russia was defeated, they could not extend their military operations outside of Germany without undertaking the serious risk of being stabbed in the back by Stalin when he considered the moment opportune. On June 22nd, 1941, German forces invaded Russia. Immediately, they took action to crush the communist menace. Britain and the United States of America pooled their resources to aid Stalin defeat the German armed forces. Convoys of ships were organized to carry munitions of war to Russia via Murmansk and the Persian Gulf. During the Irish Rebellion, a Security Regulation 18B had been passed by order to council to enable the English police to detain and interrogate people they suspected might be members of the Irish Republican Army, intent on committing acts of annoyance or sabotage. In 1940, the practice had been discontinued for many years. On May 23, 1940, during the first 2 weeks of Mr. Churchill's premiership, he used this opposite regulation to arrest all the prominent people who had tried to prevent Britain from being dragged into a war with Germany prior to September 1939, and those who had opposed his policy to turn the phony war into a fighting war. Many hundreds of British subjects were arrested without any charge being made against them. They were thrown into prison without trial under Regulation 18B, which deprived them of the rights and privileges of the Habeas Corpus Act. Magna Carta was ignored and ridiculed. These wholesale arrests were made by the police on the unsupported statements of Mr. Herbert Morrison that he, as Secretary of State, had reasonable cause to believe that the said persons had been recently concerned in acts prejudicial to the public safety, in defense of the realm, or in the preparation or investigation of such acts, and that by reason thereof it was necessary to exercise control over them. Captain Ramsay, Admiral Sir Barry Domville, Their wives and friends and hundreds of other citizens were thrown into Brixton Prison. Some of them were detained until September 1944. They were treated like criminals, and far worse than prisoners on remands. Just prior to this outrageous action on the part of those who did the bidding of the international bankers, the press, controlled by money barons, had conducted a hysterical propaganda campaign claiming Germany had a strong and well-organized fifth column in Great Britain, ready to give aid to invading German troops the moment they landed. Subsequent investigation proved that the very competent British intelligence service never produced at that time or since even the flimsiest evidence of any of those arrested were ever engaged in any conspiracy. There is plenty of evidence to prove that the newly formed British government under Churchill was ordered to take this unjust action against the prominent and influential people in Britain who had voiced their opinion that international Jewry had promoted the war between Britain and Germany. Just before the wholesale arrests were made, Mrs. Nicholson, the wife of Admiral Nicholson, another very distinguished British naval officer, had been arrested as a result of a smear campaign. She had stated publicly she thought the plot to involve Britain in a war with Germany was the work of the international Jewish bankers. 4 charges were actually framed against Mrs. Nicholson. She was tried by judge and jury. She was acquitted on all counts. This action on the part of the judge and jury did not suit those who were determined to persecute people who object to the international bankers in Britain, France, and America running the affairs of the nation so as to inveigle them into another global war. So the antiquated Regulation 18b was used to put them out of the way. The phony war became a fighting war. The British and German empires weakened as those who started the wars strengthened their position. The Illuminati laughed up their sleeve. Notwithstanding the fact that Mrs. Nicholson had been exonerated of all guilt and blame regarding the charges laid against her, she was amongst those arrested and imprisoned under Regulation 18b in May 1940. Captain Ramsay tells the whole story of the events that led up to his arrest and imprisonment in his book, The Nameless War. Admiral Sir Barry Domville tells of his experiences in the book, From Admiral to Cabin Boy. These are books which should be read by every person interested in the continuance of freedom. Mr. Neville Chamberlain died in 1940. He was worn out in body and soul fighting the secret powers, who govern from behind the scenes. So also had died Mr. William Pitt. But those who swim with the tide of Illuminism and do as they are told usually live to a ripe old age. They are showered with earthly honor and worldly wealth. There is one thing is certain. They can't take wealth and honors with them when they die, and after death will come the judgment. That was Chapter 17 of Pawns in the Game by William Guy Carr. If you have enjoyed this audiobook and want to see more like it, please consider subscribing. It would be greatly appreciated. And to next week for Chapter 18, The Present Dangers.